Pennsylvania and across the country, boys lag behind girls in nearly every educational benchmark. Girls, on average, have better grades in high school and college and are more likely to be enrolled in advanced placement classes. Boys are much more likely to be held back, diagnosed with a learning disability, or placed in a remedial or special education class. They're also less likely to graduate from college. Are schools now shortchanging boys? Do we need a campaign to re-empower boys? Good evening and welcome to Pennsylvania Inside Out Live. I'm Patty Satalia. Explanations for today's educational gender gap are all over the map with no consensus regarding the scope of the problem, let alone how to solve it. We'll talk about that. We'll also take your phone calls at 1-800-543-8242. Now let's meet our guest. Karen Bierman is a distinguished professor of psychology from Penn State. Two of her current research trials involve prevention programs to enhance school engagement and emergent literacy, particularly among economically disadvantaged and minority students. Susan McHale is a professor of human development at Penn State. Her research interests include gender roles and gender dynamics in the family. And joining us a little later by telephone from WHYY-TV in Philadelphia will be Dr. Michael Smith. He's a professor of education at Temple University and co-author of Reading Don't Fix No Chevys, Literacy in the Lives of Young Men. Thank you all so much for joining us. You're aware more than anyone, I'm sure, that there have been numerous books and articles on what's described as a looming educational crisis for boys and ultimately for men. What do you make of this? Is there hard evidence to support this sort of moral panic in the country that boys are really in trouble?
Well, there's certainly evidence that girls are doing much better than they used to do, and that's created a real imbalance in terms of the achievement that you see both from the very beginning of skill differences at school entry that then extends all the way through school.
The National Center for Education Statistics reports that girls have been outscoring boys in reading, in particular, since 1970. The most recent test scores in 2005 show a 10-point gap at 8th grade between boys and girls. Is there agreement, though, on the source of boys' problems and any appropriate remedies?
I think it's overdetermined. I think there's so many different reasons, some of which you mentioned, having to do with learning disabilities and late starts and so forth, that it's going to be a tricky problem to tease apart.
In the case of boys, is it that boys are performing worse or girls are just, you said a moment ago, it's really that girls are performing better, not necessarily that the boys aren't doing as well as they used to? And if that's the case, why all the articles? Why all the concern?
Well, I mean, it still leads to a real imbalance now in terms of actual achievement levels and who's making it through school and who's going on to college and who's doing well out of college. So even if the good news is that the girls are now advantaged, it still leads to a differential, and it still makes us really ask the question, in what ways is the school system now not serving boys?
Now, back in the 80s, there was a national campaign to empower girls, and obviously it has worked, and there were lots of powerful women behind that movement, college professors, authors, the National Organization for Women. Do we now need, in your opinion, a full-blown campaign to re-empower boys?
I think we do. I think the statistics are pretty frightening. And I also think that even though it may be that girls are doing better than boys, or better than they used to, and boys aren't doing so badly, what happens, it's sort of a vicious circle. Once academics becomes girls' domain, boys aren't going to want to compete in that domain, and it's going to escalate downward, I think, we can make academics boys' domain again.
What's interesting is back in the 1980s, all of the people that I mentioned, the college professors, the authors like Mary Pfeiffer, they got together and they started this united front. And from what I'm reading, there isn't the same level of unity to help boys as there was to empower girls. Is that because girls are better at organizing things? I'm not sure why.
I don't know. I think it's actually more that it's just becoming evident how great the imbalance is and what the projections are for the future. So I think it's more that it's just now becoming more clear that we have a real problem emerging.
And I think that social class and race has to do with that, because we may have seen the patterns earlier on in poor boys and minority boys, but people just weren't paying attention.
Okay, we have Michael Smith joining us from WHYY in Philadelphia. Thanks so much for joining us this evening.
Delighted to be here.
We're talking, you probably missed the beginning of our conversation, but we're talking about is there a moral panic in this country, a feeling that boys have had this sudden drop in academic performance, and how concerned are you about that?
Well, I think think that it's not so much that the boys have dropped, but that the girls are exceeding where they have been historically. So and I think also that we need to look not only at boys in general, but also at the intersections of race and class and gender, so that how much of what we attribute to gender might be a much more complicated intersection of a variety of factors.
Now, Michael Gurian, who is an author and a family therapist, he says that the gap exists because boys' brains and girls' brains are wired differently. I want you first, Dr. Smith, to comment on that.
Well, I'm not a brain researcher, but it seems to me that we're going a little bit quickly on what the implications of brain research is. We know that there's some physiological differences, but what those mean as far as how things would play out in the classroom, I don't think we're quite so sure of. The other thing that I worry about with the brain research is that it acts as though all boys are going to be the same. And we know for sure that that's not the case. So the more that we attribute the differences to biology, I think the greater our tendency is to treat either boys or girls as homogeneous. And I don't think that that's an appropriate way to understand the kids that we have in our homes or in our classrooms.
Now, you're shaking your head in agreement, but you also do family research, and I'm wondering what role the way mothers and fathers treat their sons and daughters has on how they perform in school.
Well, a lot of research has been done on the extent to which mothers and fathers treat boys and girls differently, and the differences aren't that stark. Mothers and fathers are very different from one another in terms of how they parent. But boys and girls are held to very similar expectations in terms of conduct, expectations for achievement if you just ask parents what they want for their children. One place where boys and girls are treated differently pretty consistently is in the kinds of activities parents do with kids and the kinds of activities they promote. So boys are pushed toward athletics, girls may be pushed more toward sedentary activities, like reading.
But studies seems to show that if girls are engaged in what would be stereotypically considered masculine activities, sports for example, they're also more inclined to do better in math and science.
That's right. That's so for girls, but it's much harder to get boys to do girl things than it is to get girls to do boy things.
The author of Raising Cain says that girls are told, go for it, you can do it, go for it. There's all this sort of encouragement, while boys are told that the way to shine is athletically. And I'd like you, Dr. Smith, to comment on that. How do you you've spent your career teaching literacy, how do you get boys interested in reading?
Well, there's no simple formula for that, but there are a couple of ideas that Jeff Wilhelm, my co-author, and I, that our research suggested to us. One is that people in general like to do things that we're good at. And so part of what we need to do, especially with adolescents, is to create situations when students are reading, that they're either comfortable having been taught how to read the text that we assign them, or that they're reading text over which they feel they have some kind of authority. So I think that one of the things that happens that distances kids from reading is that at some point, especially as they get in secondary school, that they're given texts that are appreciably more difficult than the ones that they would have selected on their own. So one of the things I think we have to do is we have to make sure that the boys have some sort of feeling of competence and control over what they're doing. One of the kids in our study said, "I'd rather say that reading was stupid than maybe have to admit that I might be stupid." Mm-hmm. So maybe our job as educators is to try to do more sort of a teaching of how to read what we ask the students to read, rather than simply assuming that they can do it and then wondering why we're not getting what we wanted to after we've given a reading assignment.
You also say it's important that teachers value the kinds of things that boys naturally like to read. For instance, boys may be able to go through an instruction manual and figure out how to put something together pretty easily, but not be able to tackle Lord of the Flies.
I think that all of our kids will benefit if we expand our understanding of what counts as reading. When we think about reading, we think about good readers as being the readers of a particular kind of long books. What we found in our study is that every kid in our study was really engaged with literacy. A lot of them, it was electronic literacies. A lot of them, it was magazines. So that but they were all competent readers in areas that they had selected. So I think that that's something both in the subject matter of text, but also in the kinds of texts that we that we encourage kids to read, and that we applaud kids for reading.
You also say that it's more motivating if the reading is done purposefully. I'm talking about for boys.
Yes.
In the context of pursuing an answer to an authentic question. I really want to know how to do this or what the answer is, rather than some of the comprehension type questions that you might have after reading harder literature, for example. Why is that important?
Well, first of all, it's what we all do. Those of us who are readers, that's something that we all do. The reason that we engage with books is because it helps us think about something that's important to us. We don't read books because we're going to have a comprehension test after them. So, for example, if we're teaching a literary text, I mean, the reason I love literature, it's because it's helped me think about ideas that are important in my life. So, one of the things that an instructional move that I would suggest is that we locate the teaching of literature around essential questions. And if we do that, then another benefit is that both literary text and non-literary text can be in relationship together. So let me give you an example. Say that I was going to teach a classic American play like Death of a Salesman. Well, one of the issues in Death of a Salesman is how having been a sports hero affects Willy Loman's kids. If I want to raise the question, on balance, has sports had a positive or negative effect on American life? Well, Death of a Salesman is an important text to read, but so too is thinking about the steroid scandal and the Jackie Robinson story and the impact of Title IX. So putting all of these things in conversation with one another, I think, provides a real motivation for kids to read them for understanding, not just to read them because they were assigned.
So reading a newspaper can be as important as reading a book, but both are
I think
both
reading I want my kids to read the newspaper. I think reading a newspaper is hugely important, and as teachers, we don't want to overlook that. Okay,
and this looks to me like there's a role for parents to play. So I'm wondering, what impact, if any, does a dad reading to his son play? So often it's mom read to the kids growing up.
And mom reads and dad watches TV. So to the extent to which parents are modeling these kinds of behaviors, boys and girls are learning what adult roles are about.
And how about if dad goes to the football game but doesn't go to the PTA meeting?
Same thing, right. Academics is important for women. It's not so important for men.
Now, you're doing a lot of work on school engagement, and I definitely see differences. I'm the mother of two sons, and I do see differences between the girls I know and the boys I know in terms of what gets them fired up at school, and I'm wondering from your research trials, what are you learning?
Well, I think when you look at the younger ages, so the school entry ages of 3, 4, and 5, we do see gender differences. So on the whole, girls tend to be a little bit more compliant in the classroom. They find it easier to follow the rules. They're a little bit more pro-social, helping and sharing more with other children. And that really makes school a little bit more engaging and interesting place for them than for many of the boys at the same age. So some of what Dr. Smith was saying about trying to tap into the interest level, there's a way in which as school demands have moved downward age-wise, that tends to be a better fit for more girls than it is for more young boys.
Okay, I have a question to follow up with that in just a moment, but if you're just joining us, this is Pennsylvania Inside Out Live on WPSU FM and TV. I'm Patty Satalia. We're talking about the gender gap in education and what schools and parents can do about it. Some see it as a matter of culture and expectations. Others say it exists because boys' and girls' brains are wired differently. Our guests are Dr. Karen Bierman, a distinguished professor of psychology from Penn State. Her current research involves school engagement and emergent literacy, particularly among economically disadvantaged and minority students. Susan McHale is a professor of human development at Penn State and an expert on gender roles and gender dynamics in the family. And joining us by telephone from Philadelphia is Dr. Michael Smith. He's a professor of education at Temple University and co-author of Reading Don't Fix No Chevys, Literacy in the Lives of Young Men. If you'd like to join the conversation, please give us a call at 1-800-543-8242. Some would argue, based on what you just said about the difference, boys are kinetic, physical in the classroom, and sitting down can be more difficult for them, and how the classroom may be more conducive to girls' learning, that boys and girls both would be better off if we had single-sex classrooms.
I don't think there's any reason to think that at the younger ages. In fact, just the opposite in terms of the complementary sorts of activities, interest, behaviors that they would engage in. You actually want that variability in the classroom. You want that more active community.
You're saying in the younger ages, which makes me think that maybe in high school separating the sexes might be better.
I'm not so sure what Dr. Smith would say about the high school age, but I think certainly at the younger ages the mix is better.
How about you, Dr. McHale?
Well, two things. One is that in addition to the different styles, we have to remember that boys and girls mature at different rates. And I think the other part of boys' problem early on, and again in adolescence, is that girls are ahead of them maturationally. So the brain wiring is one issue, but the maturation level is another. I agree with Karen that it does help to have the balance in the classroom. And I think Dr. Smith made the point that you know, boy and girl is one label, but there are a lot of girls who are more like the typical boy than they are like the typical girl. And once you start segregating kids just on the basis of their biological sex, I think it could be dangerous at any grade.
In fact, Dr. Smith, you say that what you found will work with boys probably works as well with girls.
Well, that's what I was going to say when the earlier remark about, I mean, girls might be willing to put up with what school demands and to sit still and so on, but I think that they would benefit from the kind of active, engaged, you know, physical learning that is commonly associated with boys as well. At least I've got girls, and at least I think my kids would. As far as the single-sex issue, one of the arguments that, or one of the things that we found in our research is how profoundly important social relationships were to the boys' literacy. Those relationships with family, with friends, with classmates, but also with teachers. And one of the things that, because of our work, Jeff and I have been asked to speak to people thinking about single-sex schools. And one of the things that I think comes with the single-sex schools is also a belief in the importance of trying to do things differently. So it's hard sometimes to separate out the same gender from in the more experimental curricula, the fact that the teachers are committed to developing relationships with the kids, and those sorts of things that sometimes come with the reform of single-sex schools, but may not, and may attribute to whatever benefits that we're seeing. It's hard to separate out which of those, all of those various related factors which have the most impact on what we're seeing in the schools.
Well, Christina Hoff Summers, who's a former college professor and now at the American Enterprise Institute, says that women teachers favor girls over boys. Is there evidence to support that?
I don't know of any evidence to support that, and I think it's probably hard to tease out because at least at the younger ages where, and I agree with Dr. Smith, because girls tend to be able to be more compliant doesn't mean they wouldn't benefit from a more engaged curriculum, but because they, through maturity, through maybe more advanced language skills, getting those skills a little bit sooner, they find it easier to connect with teachers. But I'm not sure that that's quite the same thing as teachers favoring girls.
Dr.
Well,
McHale?
one of the reasons that the women's movement got so concerned about girls was because of some maybe older data suggesting that teachers were favoring boys by calling on them more, by asking them harder, open-ended questions.
And boys were more inclined to raise their hand whether they knew the
Shout
answer
out.
or not.
They didn't need to even raise their hands. It was accepted when they shouted out, where it wasn't accepted when girls were doing the same kind of thing. So I think those kinds of observations is what led to this interest in girls' empowerment, and it's, you know, it's boys' turn.
Our telephone number is 1-800-543-8242. This is Pennsylvania Inside Out Live on WPSU. We'll go to our first phone call. It's Ron who's calling us from State College. Go ahead, please, Ron. Is Ron with us? Well, we'll check back in a moment. We're having our share of technical difficulties this evening. Would more male teachers help? This problem of boys lagging behind?
Well, one thought early on about boys in school was that especially the elementary years are a very feminine environment. And one of the reasons why boys need to sit down and pay attention is because that's a more comfortable context for maybe women teachers. And so that to the extent to which males serve as models for academic interest, it's no longer a girl thing to do well in school and to be interested in academics, and to the extent to which their style is different, it might be more fit for boys.
In our study, not a single kid talked about the importance of having same-gender teachers. When they classed their teachers, when they put them into categories, they didn't put them into the men teachers on the one hand and the women teachers on the other hand. The categories that our respondents put teachers in is they call them the helpers and the assigners. And the teachers who were assigners simply counted on the homework and the work that they assigned as instructing the kids. And those were the teachers that our students, that our respondents resisted. The ones that they really enjoyed and that they did the work for were the teachers who were thought to really be concerned with the kids' success and really working hard and really teaching them to do the work that they wanted them to do before they asked them to do the work. So we didn't see that sort of gender
being an issue.
Being an issue. Now, we did see one of the schools at which we work was a private boys' academy. There were some sort of cultural issues in the school that seemed to support boys' achievement. One of the kids said, "We do history here," and so that kids were, sort of engaged in history in a way that we didn't see in the other schools. And that I don't think that was related to the. It was related to sort of the norms of the school rather than the gender or the biological sex of the teachers.
All right, I want to follow up on that in just a minute, but first I want to take this phone call. I think we have Ron on the air now from State College. Ron, are you there?
You got my question answered.
Oh,
with male teachers.
ask us another one.
Well, how about 80% of the individuals with autism are boys and 75% in special ed are males? Is that helping?
Is there a reason to explain why boys are disproportionately represented in the special education classes, as he said, more are autistic and have all sorts of range of
right.
learning problems?
There is evidence that boys are more vulnerable to a host of birth defects, including learning disabilities, that most people think has to do with their increased vulnerability during fetal development. And so to some extent, some of those differences we would not attribute to what's happening in the schools. On the other hand, in terms of how children progress through the special ed system, there are a certain portion of children who are getting placed in learning disability classrooms for problems with inattention and behavioral control in the classroom. Some of those may be biological, but some may also come from the disinterest, from the difficulty with inhibiting inappropriate behavior, and the lack of engagement. So there's probably to some extent a biological issue, but perhaps some also effect of the school things that we've talked about.
Well, getting to the engagement things, as Dr. Smith said a moment ago, boys tend to do things that they're good at, and they quit things unless they see some progress. You talked, Dr. Smith, about teachers building bridges between the known and the new. Give us something concrete that will explain to us how you go about doing that.
Okay. Well, one of the things that we can do is that have kids access their life experience and to know that that's part of what they're supposed to do when they engage in literacy. So, I mean, a classic story was a kid talking with a kid where he's reading a story about a baseball game, and the kid's a baseball player. So there's a character who's on first base. There's a character then in the next scene of the story, the character's on second base, and the character has a bloody knee. So the teacher says, "Well, how did he get his bloody knee?" And the kid says, "Well, I don't know. It doesn't say in the book." Well, what that's teaching us is that he didn't feel authorized. He didn't feel that his life experience as a baseball player, I mean, he had to know that the kid slid into second base. How else did he get bloody in baseball? But he didn't feel that was something that he could apply. So one of the things we found in our study is that at least some of the kids drew a very strong line between their out-of-school and their in-school lives. So much so that one of the young men in our study wouldn't call what he did with with the newspaper reading, because reading is what you did at school. What you did outside of school was looking at.
Oh, and it had to be hard literature probably if it were in school.
Well, but you know what? At first I thought he meant he was just looking at the pictures, but it turned out he wasn't. He was what anybody else would say reading, but he didn't want to call it reading because reading is what we do in school. So so that's one way of moving from the known to the new. Another way to do it is to give kids have. A lot of kids don't like to read stories. I don't know many kids who don't like to watch stories on television and on the movies. And we can tap their understandings of how narrative works that they see in other media as a way to make connections with the text that they're reading. Same thing with music. All of the boys in our study, the music that they listened to varied, but all of them had very powerful musical taste, and music was an important part of our life. We can make links between the reading that we ask kids to do and the music that they're listening to. So there are lots of things that I think that we can do to move from the known to the new, to move from the more familiar to the less familiar, move from the from personal experience to some extent to experience that's distant from there.
So perhaps lots of nonfiction in the library about athletes or musicians and that sort of thing. Let's go to Rick, who's calling us from State College. Go ahead, please, Rick.
Good evening.
Hi.
Hi. I want to say that I think we all form our opinions from our personal experience, and with that, I consider myself very fortunate to have gone to grade school and high school before the concept of middle school was invented. It had been invented, but where I went to school, the population was declining, and they just didn't invest the money in building these places, which I think are a tremendous part of the problem. The fact is, when you put 18 to 15 young pre-adolescent boys together in a grade school, they're far more controllable than when you put 200 to 250 of them together in a middle school. Now, because you folks are academicians, I suppose you won't take something that 60 Minutes or CBS said very seriously, but they took a camera crew to a middle school somewhere and filmed what was going on, and what they found was that there just was tremendous interaction between the female students and the female teachers, while young men sat there waving their hands trying to get attention and got no attention, and especially just started goofing off and doing what young men do when they're left alone to their own
So would you support what we talked about earlier, which would be single-sex classrooms in the high school or middle school level?
No, I think that would be a total disaster. I just think and agree with the critics of the middle school concept. I think they should all be closed down, and they should go back to smaller schools where kids go to grade school up to 8th grade and then on to high school.
Let's get our guest here today to comment on that. Dr. Bierman?
Yeah, this is just an area of a lot of discussion. I think that there's certainly evidence to support what you're saying about those middle school years, those pre-adolescent, early adolescent years being very important for the beginning of a lot of risks like substance use and early risky sexual activity. It's when grades begin to decline in the entire population, and so that developmental period, I think you're absolutely right, it's critical for us to look at it. I think, unfortunately, we haven't discovered the magic solution yet, and although some districts are doing exactly what you described, going back to a K-8 system, that also has some problems associated with it. So I think it's a developmental period that's really important for us to take a closer look at.
Dr. McHale?
I completely agree. In our data on Central Pennsylvania families, we see a precipitous drop in students' academic interests across the junior high school years. Both boys and girls, but stronger for boys. But I will say that parents have an influence, because what we find is that when parents express strong interest in academics, we don't see the same kind of decline.
Interesting. Go ahead, Dr. Smith.
Well, I was going to say that one of the things I think we need to do is what happens in 6th grade that might cause that to occur. So one of the things that I'm interested in is, if you think about the grade in school that kids have the most choice, it's probably kindergarten. They have free play. They have their choice of reading materials and so on. And to some extent, I think kids' choice is reduced as they go through school, so that as they're getting developmentally needing to, display their individuality and so on, what's happening in schools is their choice is being restricted. So that's one thing that happens. Another thing that happens is in the middle schools, all of a sudden we ask them that we give them texts that are really hard. So that in elementary school, it's very common for a teacher to, my kids had the 5-finger rule. They read a book and they open a page, and if they hold up their hand, and if every time they get to a word that they don't know, they put down a finger. And if they've got a fist before they finish the page, the teacher says, put that book away, it's too hard for you. Well, around middle school, that stops. And we sort of don't care if it's too hard for them anymore. That's in the curriculum, after all, and we want them to read it. We know what happens in writing is that around the 6th grade and 7th grade, writing apprehension increases, in part, I think, because that's when the red pen comes out, and that we're doing less celebrating kids for their ideas and more focusing on their formal correctness. So I think I'm not sure that, and I think as teachers, there are a lot of teachers who are secondary school teachers who think of themselves primarily as teachers of a subject rather than teaching kids a subject, if you see what I'm saying. And that's a different orientation. So some of what the caller said may be a function not of the size, but the kind of relationships and the kind of consideration and the kind of care that students might get in a smaller situation as opposed to the larger one. But I think it's possible to display that in a departmentalized middle school. We just have to work at it.
I do think one thing that Rick, the caller, mentioned, though, was the change in the peer system, and I think that's really important, that the increases in bullying, in victimization, there's an emergence in middle school of what's called perceived popularity, which is really about boys who are able to command a lot of dominance through sort of physical intimidation, are perceived to be popular kids. And so there really are
They might be infamous is what they are sometimes.
Infamous, but if you ask who's popular.
Because they all know his name.
Right, and so you think, what's that peer system doing in terms of norm setting and modeling? So I think it's a very complicated age.
Our telephone number is 1-800-543-8242, and we did have Rick on the line, but we just lost him, so maybe Rick will call back. You said something, Dr. Smith, that I thought was interesting. It sounds like allowing boys to choose what they read might be a reasonable first step to get them more engaged, but I also wanted to talk about the writing part of this, and I read Frank McCourt's book, Teacher Man, and I thought he was really very creative in his writing assignments. He had kids writing obituaries. He had kids writing excuses for missing school, things that made them relevant, made them fun, and it turned out that the kids really produced some pretty powerful writing. Can you comment on that?
I want to get back to, when I think about the teaching of writing, I think that interesting assignments are really important, but what's even more important than that is that the kids feel prepared to be successful on those assignments. So whether it's an obituary or an interview or an autobiography, that you've done some work with giving kids practice in the kinds of things that go into that kind of writing before we ask them to do it. So I think, a variety of kinds of writing assignments is wonderful, especially if they're preceded by instruction that help kids meet the demands of those assignments.
Did you have something to add?
No, I mean, I think that makes a lot of sense, that the issue, Dr. Smith has mentioned the issue of competence, and then I think this sort of goal orientation. What are they really interested in that they feel competent and focused on?
How can you explain why boys and girls, but a lot of boys who might not ordinarily read, have sort of caught on fire with the Harry Potter series, Dr. Smith?
Well, I think it's really interesting for a variety of reasons. And one of the things that I think happens is that I think about it in terms of the sort of social dimension of literacy that I was talking about before. For a lot of kids, that's the first really long book that they read. And they do it because kids are reading it, and then so there's sort of a social dimension to doing it. And if you think about when a new book comes out, everybody goes to the bookstore at midnight, and there's this Harry Potter club. But there's also, I think, a real connection with the characters. One of my daughters is a reader of Harry Potter, and I think one of the reasons she likes to read it and she embraces the new books is that she wants to hang out with her friends. That
and
is
be
the
able to
people in the
talk
book.
intelligently about
she wants to hang out. She wants to hang out with Hermione and Ron and Harry some more. She hasn't had a chance to do it for a while. So I think that one of the things that motivates Harry Potter is a similar thing that motivates the series Unfortunate Events, and for adults that motivates the serial mystery writers. If you have been away from a character that you care about for a while, you want to go back, and you want to spend some time with that character. So I don't know for sure what's caused that, but that's one of the things that I'm thinking might be have a real powerful impact on the popularity of those books.
This sort of blows the hole in the myth, though, that the teenage boys are less social than girls. If they're reading Harry Potter so that they can talk about it with their friends.
Well, that's a little bit younger, though. I think the Harry Potter is probably more popular in grade school and maybe beginning junior high than it is in high school.
I will say that there, in the sort of post-Columbine Boys in Trouble sort of literature that came out, that does picture boys as sort of alienated loners. In our research, all of the boys in our study had a close-knit group of friends with whom they were very intimate. Now, that varied in size. For a couple of kids, it was just one other person. For most of them, it was 3 or 4 or 5. It was one of the things that was most interesting to me and Jeff, because when we were growing up, actually, we had more friends with whom we were less intimate. We hung around with groups of 8 or 10, and partly because that's how many it would take to have a football game. But the kids in our study had small groups of very close-knit friends with whom they felt very, very connected.
We're talking about this because people across the country are more and more concerned and aware of the fact that boys are lagging behind, and a statistician sort of took this to almost a ridiculous end to say, well, currently 60% of college students are female, and if this trend continues, by the year 2068, there will be the last male student will graduate. So I'm wondering, I don't think that's what's going to happen, but how concerned are you that we may, if this continues, have a white-collar female population and a blue-collar male population? Is that the logical end? I'll start with you, Dr. Bierman.
It's hard to know how far those trends will continue, but I do think there's reason for concern that, as Susan was saying earlier, this sort of shifting over in gender roles in the school as more girls are progressing ahead, I think it's hard to know how that will play out. And even when you think about something like having friendships, those aren't necessarily protective of particular competence domains unless those friends are invested as well. So if you have close friends, but your close friends are alienated from school, and your close friends are interested in maybe risky behaviors outside of school, you're better off not having a friend, because that kind of close friendship actually can pull you into those events. So I do think there is something about numbers, that we want to move the majority of boys into the same trajectory toward academic success as girls. And we want to keep our, even though it doesn't look like boys are doing worse than before, because their proportions are dwindling, I think we do want to attend to that and figure out how to bring that greater equality.
What impact does a sibling who's engaged in the risky behavior, she was talking about friends, but what if it's your brother or sister?
Yeah. Well, there's a burgeoning body of research on sibling influences, and a lot of suggestion that if you have an older sibling especially who's involved in risky behavior, you're likely to fall right behind, especially if you have a good relationship. So
okay. You talked, Dr. Smith, about this being a bigger problem among socioeconomically disadvantaged families or minority students. Tell us what you're doing and what you think needs to be done to start to address this problem.
Well, one of the things I think we need to think hard about what we're doing and not just do it because that's the way we've always done it. I mean, for example, I made the argument before about competence as being so important in boys' literate lives, and yet they get to junior and senior year in high school, and their literature classes are typically arranged chronologically. So they read the oldest works first. Well, that means that they're reading the hardest works first. That doesn't make any sense to me. So one of the things that I think we want to do is we want to look hard at some practices that we're using and make sure that that's supporting the ends that we want to make. I think also what happens is that because we see because of the concern with achievement of both boys and girls, we do things like summer reading lists. Well, if a kid's been resistant to reading in school for 10 months or for 9 months, assigning the kid to do reading over the summer doesn't seem to me to make a huge amount of sense. So I think that sometimes what we're asking kids to do, I mean, I would much rather, for example, for summer reading, ask kids to come up with their own summer reading plans as opposed to assigning a particular summer reading book, if you see what I'm saying. So I think that one of the things that I would recommend is that we make some changes or think about changes in the curriculum. Another one that I would suggest is surround literature with non-literary texts, as I said before, in service of those essential questions, so that the kids can understand that there's a payoff for doing this reading because it helps me think about something that really matters.
If you're just joining us, this is Pennsylvania Inside Out Live on WPSU FM and TV. I'm Patty Satalia. We're talking about the gender gap in education and what schools and parents can do about it. Our guests today are Dr. Karen Bierman. She is a professor of psychology at Penn State, and Dr. Susan McHale, who is a professor of health and human development. And also joining us from WHYY in Philadelphia, Dr. Michael Smith, a professor of education at Temple University. He's the co-author of Reading Don't Fix No Chevys, Literacy in the Lives of Young Men. We talked about this earlier in the program, but there was back in the beginning in the 80s and then even into the 90s this whole national campaign to empower girls. Some say that has come at the cost of boys. So I'm wondering if you believe that that's the case, that it was feminism gone awry, or if what we really need to do now is just start putting the energy we put into girls into boys. Dr. McHale?
I think that's the answer. I think that we can learn a lot from that movement, that you can really make a difference in kids' lives and how they learn and what they like about school and so forth, and we just need to try the same things with boys. I also agree with the comments that have been made that what's good for boys may also be good for girls. There is some evidence in some cases that girls on average may have different kinds of learning styles. So for example, boys might like a competitive learning situation with lots of tests and scary things like that, whereas girls do much better with more collaborative, continuous assessment kinds of situations. So I think we need to be careful about the one-size-fits-all strategy.
And in fact, Dr. Smith, you say we need to be careful about pitting boys against girls. That's certainly what we don't want to do.
Absolutely. And it's become a pretty polarized debate. I mean, Christina Hoff Sommers' book is a pretty polarizing book. And so and that's one of the reasons I worry about the biological explanations, because to the extent that we reduce it to biology, then it becomes a zero-sum game. What helps boys doesn't help girls. So I think that and as I said before, one of the things I worry especially about that is that then we're treating all boys as though they are the same. And so that to say on average boys might like X more than girls doesn't mean that all boys do, and it certainly means there's going to be a huge amount of overlap between the girls who like it most and the boys who like it least, and so on. So I think that we want to avoid making too hasty generalizations about what it is good for one as opposed to being good for the other, and really concentrate on frequent and varied kinds of assessments, for example, so that we're being I guess we're reflecting or trying to see the strengths that all of our kids bring with them.
Okay, we go to James, who's calling us from State College. Go ahead, please, James.
I'm wondering if this question's contrived when you consider the demographic shift from the late 70s and the beginning in earnest of the feminist movement. And at that point in time, we had a shift from home economics and community relations and volunteerism, and those things that were done through the home and the community as volunteer shifted into the marketplace. And these jobs that are available now that weren't available then, things like daycare, extended daycare, expanded health, psychological, social needs, just aren't attractive to boys at this point in time.
Yeah, I mean, that could be the case, but even if you drill down further into the years of school, I think the differences that we're seeing in school performance, you know, where we're seeing them really even at school entry, even in the preschool years, there's not all of that is being driven just by occupational choices. Although I do think you're right that as the economy shifts and the opportunities for different eventual professions shift, that might have some impact on later career trajectories. I wanted to mention earlier, Patty, you had brought up this issue of gender and how that interfaces with race and with poverty. And I think that's one of the biggest things for us to explain in this new gender gap is how great it is among children of color and children growing up in poverty, much greater than...
And what possible explanations, what kind of explanations are you at least theorizing about?
I think it may be some of the things, some of the issues that the college is bringing up that have come up in the prior conversation, that school is even more irrelevant if you are growing up in a somewhat limited, disadvantaged environment where the role models are quite limited and where the extra support for developing a wide range of interests and competencies doesn't exist for you.
All right, James, do you have another question or comment for us?
No, but I appreciate your discussing this tonight, and I'll continue to listen. Thanks.
All right, thank you. This doesn't necessarily square, though, what we're talking about with the fact that men still earn more than women. Men still hold the majority of CEO positions, and more men are politicians and that sort of thing. Do you think that we're going to see a shift in that as well? And any comments about those kinds of changes as well, Dr. McHale?
Well, I don't know. What I was thinking about earlier had to do with the fact that in terms of occupation, the jobs that we're not able to fill are the technology jobs and the science jobs, and there's been some hand-wringing about engineers and science experts, the traditional male domain. And I don't know that we're going to get girls going into those jobs because you know, the same kinds of things that are turning boys off of those occupations and those education trajectories may be the same kinds of reasons girls have never gone into them.
You know, we've talked about all of the disadvantages boys have in terms of learning disabilities and that sort of thing, but statistically there are more boy geniuses than girl geniuses.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, I was going to mention that before. Boys are just more variable than girls, so we see them at both ends of the distribution, yeah. Okay. Especially in math and science.
We talked just a moment ago about race and that sort of thing. I know in your study, Dr. Smith, you did, aside from working with students in all boys prep schools, you did do a lot of work with minority students. Can you share anything that you learned from that experience?
Well, one of the things that we saw was that there was we really saw the issue of the difference that class played in the way that the kids were thinking about the trajectories of their lives. So that when we talked with the kids about what they wanted to do in the future, it was very interesting that the kids in the urban school, and we worked at an alternative school for kids who had left the urban school, and then high achievers, medium achievers, and low achievers in the traditional school. We talked with them about their future lives. Most of them had what seemed to us to be a pretty specific plan. Well, first I'm going to do this, and then I'm going to open this, and then I'm going to do, and then I'm going to go to a 2-year college. Whereas the kids in the private boys' academy, they were much more certain that their future was going to turn out okay. And it was so much so that actually Jeff, my co-author, did the interviews at the private boys' academy. And after I read the interviews that he did, I said, Jeff, let me guess who the scholarship kids are. And I was able to pick them all out just because of that sort of confidence that the kids of middle class and the upper middle class had about their futures in the world was not something that was shared by the kids in the urban school.
Mm-hmm.
So that was a really interesting difference. And one of the things that was especially interesting to us is that we saw some of those kids. We saw a lot of surprises in the kids in the urban situation. One kid was very involved with literacy in his church, but had dropped out of school. He was in the alternative school. And so I sort of talked to him about it, and he said, well, the people in church care about me. And he didn't feel the same sort of connection both to his classmates and to the institution of school that he did with his church. One of the kids in the urban center, there was a river that went through the town, and he would go and take pictures of sunsets, stuff that you wouldn't expect. So that we had a lot of surprises in the literate lives. Taught us not to underestimate what they were capable of, but also taught us that there were resources that kids bring with them to school that we might be able to do a better job of capitalizing on.
Okay, we want to go to, I think probably our final caller. He's calling from Ridgeway. Go ahead, please.
Yeah, I have a different take than one I've heard before, and basically I don't think it's so much a difference between men and boys and women. It's just a change in our school system completely. And I want to be clear that I'm not blaming the teachers or the schools, because I think a lot of this comes up from on high. But my son just started kindergarten, and every day he gets sent home with 5 pages of homework.
In kindergarten?
In kindergarten, they're all
Whoa.
coloring, alphabet, and numbers. And these are all things that he's known. Now, he doesn't write very well because he's not developmentally ready. On the other hand, he's had one science paper, and it was just how to tell what a spider is. A spider versus a bug. And this is a kid, I'm a biologist. My husband is very much into the outdoors. I mean, I've taught him since he was 2 about the world around him. And I think, there's no creativity. I get these notes saying, well, he doesn't want to finish his work. He's wandering. And I'm sitting there saying, yeah, he's bored. And I don't blame the teacher, but, I think that's, I think the boys are much less able to adapt to that, and girls who are kinesthetic learners also.
Well, you say something interesting. My son, when he was in the same grade, had on his report card it says, your son does not, I won't say his name, does not like art.
Right.
And what it really was he didn't like to follow instructions. Because really art was
and
not art.
Not
it was
art.
taping.
That's
right.
the other thing is that's
it was
crap.
following instructions.
That's not art.
Right. So
I think you are absolutely correct, though, that the expectations have changed, and now they're really things that used to really be left for first grade have moved down into the kindergarten curriculum, and there's more concern with the acquisition. There's been research that children who know letters and numbers before they enter kindergarten do better many years later in grade, so that's pushed preschools to do more
But homework certainly sounds overboard. In fact, a lot of studies say there shouldn't be homework until after 3rd grade.
Right. The issue is not so much, that the development of early skills is an advantage for anyone, but it's a question of how are those early skills taught. And there's a lot of concern that as schools move toward these very concrete pieces of knowledge, they're giving up on enriching the learning environment that particularly young children, like you describe your son, really need. That interactive, they need that engaging learning experience. A lot of brain development happens between the ages of 4 and 7, and so pushing down that same style of instruction that might be fine for 8-year-olds down into those 4 and 5s, it really is difficult for many kids. And I think you are probably right, disadvantages boys more than girls.
We have less than 2 minutes remaining, so I'd like to go around the horn with some final advice for parents. And this is probably more appropriate for you, Dr. McHale, but what advice, given the problem, would you have for parents?
I think it's important to pay attention to how your child is doing. Try to connect well with the school. Give them information about your child that they may not have that will help them understand how to work more effectively.
Dr. McHale?
Be an advocate for your child. Also, get to know your child, what their interests are, and try to make the connections for your child between what they like to do in everyday life and where to find it in school.
Dr. Smith?
And I'd sort of piggyback on that, notice what your kids are good at. Notice if your kid's not reading the books that you would want, notice what your kid is reading and celebrate that, and see if you can make connections between the literate activities that they are embracing and the ones that you want to urge them to do.
Okay, and I do hope that there will be a national effort to get boys on equal footing with girls. But do any of you, and we just have a couple of seconds remaining, worry that we might see the seesaw tip back for girls?
If we cast it as a zero-sum game, there's always that risk. But if we don't, and also if we think about gender as sort of this essential quality, then we have that risk. But if we see things in a more complicated way, I don't think that we bear that risk. We just have to be careful not to go for the sound bites and to jump when we see the headlines, either boys in crisis or girls in crisis.
And with the soundbite in mind,
okay.
Give us a soundbite.
Well, I'm not sure I can do that, but I agree that we don't want to pay attention to gender, because that's when everybody can get what's good for them.
Okay. Thanks so much for being with us this evening. Appreciate it very much. Our guests tonight have been Dr. Karen Bierman. She's a distinguished professor of psychology. Dr. Susan McHale, she's a professor of human development, both from Penn State. And Dr. Smith, a professor of education at Temple University. And thank you for calling in. I'm Patty Satalia. For all of us here at WPSU, thanks for joining us. Have a good night.
A copy of the program you've just seen can be purchased through Penn State Media Sales at mediasales.psu.edu or by calling 800-770-2111.